This is an audiobook for Stephen King's series The Dark Tower, starting with Book 1, The Gunslinger. Chapter 2, The Way Station. 2. The sky was white, perfectly white, and the smell of rain was in the air. The smell of hedges and growing green was strong and sweet. It was deep spring. David sat on Cuthbert's arm, a small engine of destruction with bright golden eyes that glared outward at nothing. The rawhide leash attached to his jesses was looped carelessly about Cuthbert's arm. Court stood aside from the two boys, a silent figure in patched leather trousers and a green cotton shirt that had been cinched high with his old, wide infantry belt. The green of his shirt merged with the hedges and the rolling turfs of the black courts, where the ladies had not yet begun to play at points. "Get ready," Roland whispered to Cuthbert. "We're ready," Cuthbert said confidently. "Aren't we, Davy?" They spoke the low speech, the language of both scullions and squires. The day when they would be allowed to use their own tongue in the presence of others was still far. "It's a beautiful day for it. Can you smell the rain? Court abruptly raised the trap in his hands and let the side fall open. The dove was out and up, trying for the sky in a quick, fluttering blast of its wings. Cuthbert pulled at the leash, but he was slow. The hawk was already up, and his takeoff was awkward. With a brief twitch of its wings, the hawk had recovered. It struck upward, gaining altitude over the dove, moving bullet swift. Court walked over to where the boys stood casually and swung his huge and twisted fist at Cuthbert's ear. The boy fell over without a sound, although his lips writhed back from his gums. A trickle of blood flowed slowly from his ear and onto the rich green grass. "You were slow," he said. Cuthbert was struggling to his feet. "I'm sorry, Court. It's just that Court swung again, and Cuthbert fell over again. The blood flowed more swiftly now. "Speak the high speech," he said softly. His voice was flat, with a slight drunken rasp. "Speak your act of contrition in the speech of civilization for which better men than you will ever be have died, maggot." Cuthbert was getting up again. Tears stood brightly in his eyes, but his lips were pressed tightly together in a bright line of hate which did not quiver. "I grieve," Cuthbert said in a voice of breathless control. "I have forgotten the face of my father, whose guns I hope someday to bear." "That's right, brat," Court said. "You'll consider what you did wrong, and bookend your reflections with hunger. No supper, no breakfast." "Look!" Roland cried. He pointed up. The hawk had climbed above the soaring dove. It glided for a moment, its stubby muscular wings outstretched and without movement on the still white spring air. Then it unfolded its wings and dropped like a stone. The two bodies came together, and for a moment Roland fancied he could see blood in the air. But it might have been his imagination. The hawk gave a brief scream of triumph. The dove fluttered, twisting, to the ground, and Roland ran toward the kill, leaving Court and the chastened Cuthbert behind him. The hawk had landed beside its prey and was complacently tearing into its plump white breast. A few feathers seesawed slowly downward. "David," the boy yelled, and tossed the hawk a piece of rabbit flesh from his poke. The hawk caught it on the fly, ingested it with an upward shaking of its back and throat, and Roland attempted to releash the bird. The hawk whirled, almost absent-mindedly, and ripped skin from Roland's arm and a long, dangling gash. Then it went back to its meal. With a grunt, Roland looped the leash again, this time catching David's diving, slashing beak on the leather gauntlet he wore. He gave the hawk another piece of meat, then hooded it. Docilely, David climbed onto his wrist. He stood up proudly, the hawk on his arm. "What's this?" Court asked, pointing to the dripping slash on Roland's forearm. The boy stationed himself to receive the blow, locking his throat against any possible cry, but no blow fell. "He struck me," Roland said. "You pissed him off," Court said. "The hawk does not fear you, boy, and the hawk never will. The hawk is God's gunslinger." Roland merely looked at Court. He was not an imaginative boy, and if Court had intended to imply a moral, it was lost on him. He was pragmatic enough to believe that it might have been one of the few foolish statements he had ever heard Court make. Cuthbert came up behind him and stuck his tongue out at Court, safely on his blind side. Roland did not smile, but nodded to him. "Go in now," Court said, taking the hawk. He pointed at Cuthbert. "But remember your reflection, maggot, and your fast, tonight and tomorrow morning." Yes, Cuthbert said, stiltedly formal now. Thank you for this instructive day. You learn, Court said, but your tongue has a bad habit of lolling from your stupid mouth when your instructor's back is turned. Mayhap the day will come when it and you will learn their respective places. He struck Cuthbert again, this time stolidly between the eyes and hard enough so that Roland heard the dull thud, the sound a mallet makes when a scullion taps a keg of beer. Cuthbert fell backward onto the lawn, his eyes cloudy and dazed at first. Then they cleared, and he stared burningly up at Court, his hatred unveiled, a pinprick as bright as the dove's blood in the center of each eye. Cuthbert nodded and parted his lips in a scarifying smile that Roland had ever seen. Then there's hope for you, Court said. When you think you can, you come for me, maggot. How did you know? Cuthbert said between his teeth. Court turned toward Roland so swiftly that Roland almost fell back a step, and then both of them would have been on the grass, decorating the new green with their blood. I saw it reflected in this maggot's eyes, he said. Remember it, Cuthbert. Last lesson for today. Cuthbert nodded again, the same frightening smile on his face. I grieve, he said. I have forgotten the face. Cut that shit, Court said, losing interest. He turned to Roland. Go on now, the both of you. If I have to look at your stupid maggot faces any longer, I'll puke my guts. Come on, Roland said. Cuthbert shook his head to clear it and got to his feet. Court was already walking down the hill in his squat, bow-legged stride, looking powerful and somehow prehistoric. The shaved and grizzled spot at the top of his head loomed at a slant, hunched. I'll kill the son of a bitch, Cuthbert said, still smiling. A large goose egg, purple and knotted, was rising mystically on his forehead. Not you or me, Roland said, suddenly bursting into a grin. You can have supper in the west kitchen with me. Cook will give us some. He'll tell Court. He is no friend of Court's, Roland said, and then shrugged. And what if he did? Cuthbert grinned back. Sure, right. I always wanted to know how the world looked when your head was on backwards and upside down. They started back together over the green lawns, casting shadows in the fine white spring light. The cook in the west kitchen was named Hax. He stood huge in food-stained whites, a man with a crude oil complexion whose ancestry was a quarter black, a quarter yellow, a quarter from the South Islands, now almost forgotten, the world had moved on, and a quarter God knew what. He shuffled about 3 high-ceilinged, steamy rooms like a tractor in low gear, wearing huge, caliph-like slippers. He was one of those rare adults who communicated with small children fairly well, and who loved them all impartially, not in a sugary way, but in a business-like fashion that may sometimes entail a hug in the same way that closing a business deal may call for a handshake. He even loved the boys who had begun the training, although they were different from other children, not always demonstrative and somehow dangerous, not in an adult way, but rather as if they were ordinary children with a slight touch of madness. And Cuthbert was not the first of Court's students whom he had fled on the sly. At this moment, he stood in front of his huge, rambling electric stove, one of the 6 working appliances left on the whole estate. It was his personal domain, and he stood there watching the 2 boys bolt the gravied meat scraps he had produced. Behind, before, and all around, cookboys, scullions, and various underlings rushed through the foaming humid air, rattling pans, stirring stew, slaving over potatoes and vegetables in nether regions. In the dimly lit pantry alcove, a washerwoman with a doughy, miserable face and hair caught up in a rag splashed water around on the floor with a mop. One of the scullery boys rushed up with a man from the guards in tow. This man, he wants you, Hax. All right, Hax nodded to the guard, and he nodded back. You boys, he said, go over to Maggie and she'll give you some pie. Then, scat. They nodded and went over to Maggie, who gave them huge wedges of pie on dinner plates, but gingerly, as if they were wild dogs that might bite her. Let's eat it on the stairs, Cuthbert said. All right. They sat behind a huge, sweating stone colonnade, out of sight of the kitchen, and gobbled their pie with their fingers. It was only moments later when they saw shadows fall on the far curving wall of the wide staircase. Roland grabbed Cuthbert's arm. Come on, he said, someone's coming. Cuthbert looked up, his face surprised and berry-stained. But the shadows stopped, still out of sight. It was Hax and the man from the guards. The boys sat where they were. If they moved now, they might be heard. The good man, the guard was saying. And Farson? In 2 weeks, the guard replied. Maybe 3. You have to come with us. There's a shipment from the freight depot. A particularly loud crash of pots and pans and a volley of catcalls directed at the hapless potboy who had dropped them blotted out some of the rest. Then the boys heard the guard finish. Poisoned meat. Risky. Ask not what the good man can do for you, the guard began, but what you can do for him, Hax sighed. Soldier, ask not. You know what it could mean, the guard said quietly. Yes, and I know my responsibilities to him. You don't need to lecture me. I love him just as you do. All right, the meat will be marked for short-term storage in your cold rooms, but you'll have to be quick. You must understand that. There are children in Farson? The cook asked sadly. It was not really a question. Children everywhere, the guard said gently. It's the children we, and he, care about. Poisoned meat. Such a strange way to care for children. Hax uttered a heavy whistling sigh. Will they curdle and hold their bellies and cry for their mammas? I suppose they will. It will be like going to sleep, the guard said, but his voice was too confidently reasonable. Of course, Hax said, and laughed. You said it yourself. Soldier, ask not. Do you enjoy seeing children under the rule of the gun when they could be under his hands, who makes the lion lie down with the lamb? Hax did not reply. I'm on duty in 20 minutes, the guard said, his voice once more calm. Give me a joint of mutton, and I will pinch one of your girls and make her giggle. When I leave, my mutton will give no cramps to your belly. Robeson. Will you? But the shadows moved away and the voices were lost. I could have killed them, Roland thought, frozen and fascinated. I could have killed them both with my knife, slit their throats like hogs. He looked at his hands now stained with gravy and berries as well as dirt from the day's lessons. Roland? He looked at Cuthbert. They looked at each other for a long moment in the fragrant semi-darkness. And a taste of warm despair rose in Roland's throat. What he felt might have been a sort of death, something as brutal and final as the death of the dove in the white sky over the games field. Hax, he thought, bewildered. Hax who put a poultice on my leg that time. Hax! And then his mind snapped closed, cutting the subject off. What he saw, even in Cuthbert's humorous intelligence face, was nothing. Nothing at all. Cuthbert's eyes were flat with Hax's doom. In Cuthbert's eyes, it had already happened. He had fed them and they had gone to the stairs to eat, and then Hax had brought the guard named Robeson to the wrong corner of the kitchen for their treasonous little tete-a-tete. That was all. In Cuthbert's eyes, Roland saw that Hax would die for his treason as a viper dies in a pit. That, and nothing else. Nothing at all. They were Gunslinger's eyes. Roland's father was only just back from the uplands, and he looked out of place amid the drapes and the chiffoned fripperies of the main receiving hall that the boys had only lately been granted access to as a sign of his apprenticeship. His father was dressed in black jeans and a blue work shirt. His cloak, dusty and streaked, torn to the lining in one place, was slung carelessly over his shoulder, with no regard for the way it and he clashed with the elegance of the room. He was desperately thin, and the heavy handlebar mustache below his nose seemed to weight his head as he looked down at his son. The guns crisscrossed over the wings of his hips, hung at the perfect angle for his hands, the worn sandalwood handles looking dull and sleepy in this languid indoor light. The head cook, his father said softly. Imagine it. The tracks that were blown upland at the railhead, the dead stock and Hendrickson, and perhaps even, imagine, he looked more closely at his son. It preys on you. Like the hawk, Roland said, it preys on you. He laughed at the startling appropriateness of the image rather than at any lightness in the situation. His father smiled. Yes, Roland said, I guess it preys on me. Cuthbert was with you, his father said. He will have told his father by now. Yes. He fed both of you when court? Yes. And Cuthbert, does it prey on him, do you think? I don't know. Such an avenue of comparison did not really interest him. He was not concerned with how his feelings compared with those of others. It preys on you because you feel you've killed? Roland shrugged, unwilling. All at once not content with this probing of his motivations. Yet you told. Why? The boy's eyes widened. How could I not? Treason was. His father waved a hand curtly. If you did it for something as cheap as a schoolbook idea, you did it unworthily. I would rather see all of Farson poisoned. I didn't. The words jerked out of him violently. I wanted to kill him, both of them, liars, snakes, they... Go ahead. They hurt me, he finished, defiant. They did something to me, changed something. I wanted to kill them for it. His father nodded. That is worthy, not moral, but it is not your place to be moral. In fact, he peered at his son, morals may always be beyond you. You are not quick like Cuthbert or Wheeler's boy. It will make you formidable. The boy, impatient before this, felt both pleased and troubled. He will hang. The boy nodded. I want to see it. Roland the elder threw his head back and roared laughter. Not as formidable as I thought, or perhaps just stupid. He closed his mouth abruptly. An arm shot out like a bolt of lightning and grabbed the boy's upper arm painfully. He grimaced, but did not flinch. His father peered at him steadily, and the boy looked back, although it was more difficult than hooding the hawk had been. All right, he said, and turned abruptly to go. Father? What? Do you know who they were talking about? Do you know who the good man is? His father turned back and looked at him speculatively. Yes, I think I do. If you caught him, Roland said in his thoughtful, near-plotting way, no one else like Cook would have to be neck-popped. His father smiled thinly, perhaps not for a while, but in the end someone always has to have his or her neck popped, as you so quaintly put it. The people demand it. Sooner or later, if there isn't a turncoat, the people make one. Yes, Roland said, grasping the concept instantly. It was one he never forgot. But if you got him... No, his father said flatly. Why? For a moment his father seemed on the verge of saying why, but he bit it back. We've talked enough for now, I think. Go out from me. He wanted to tell his father not to forget his promise when it came time for Hax to step through the trap, but he was sensitive to his father's moods. He suspected his father wanted to fuck. He closed that door quickly. He was aware that his mother and father did that thing together, and he was reasonably well informed as to what that act was, but the mental picture that always condensed with the thought made him feel both uneasy and oddly guilty. Some years later, Susan would tell him the story of Oedipus, and he would absorb it in a quiet thoughtfulness, thinking of the odd and bloody triangle formed by his father, his mother, and by Martin, known in some quarters as the good man. Or perhaps it was a quadrangle, if one wished to add himself. Good night, father, Roland said. Good night, son, his father said absently, and began unbuttoning his shirt. In his mind, the boy was already gone. Like father, like son. Gallows Hill was on the Farson Road, which was nicely poetic. Cuthbert might have appreciated this, but Roland did not. He did appreciate the splendidly ominous scaffold which climbed into the brilliantly blue sky, a black and angular silhouette which overhung the coach road. The two boys had been let out of morning exercises. Court had read the notes from their fathers laboriously, lips moving, nodding here and there. When he finished with them both, he had looked up at the blue-violet dawn sky and had nodded again. Wait here, he said, and he went to the leaning stone hut that was his living quarters. He came back with a slice of rough, unleavened bread, broke it in two, and gave half to each. When it's over, each of you will put this beneath his shoes. Mind you do exactly as I say, or I'll clout you into next week. They had not understood until they arrived, riding double on Cuthbert's gelding. They were the first, fully 2 hours ahead of anyone else and 4 hours before the hanging, and Gallows Hill stood deserted, except for the rooks and ravens. The birds were everywhere, and of course they were all black. They roosted noisily on the hard, jutting bar that overhung the trap, the armature of death. They sat in a row along the edge of the platform. They jostled for position on the stairs. They leave them, Cuthbert muttered, for the birds. Let's go up, Roland said. Cuthbert looked at him with something like horror. Do you think? Roland cut him off with a gesture of his hands. We're years early. No one will come. All right. They walked slowly toward the gibbet, and the birds took indignant wing, cawing and circling like a mob of angry, dispossessed peasants. Their bodies were flat and black against the pure dawnlight of the sky. For the first time, Roland felt the enormity of his responsibility in the matter. This wood was not noble, not part of the awesome machine of civilization, but merely warped pine covered with splattered white bird droppings. It was splashed everywhere. Stairs, railing, platform, and it stank. The boy turned to Cuthbert with startled, terrified eyes and saw Cuthbert looking back at him with the same expression. I can't, Cuthbert whispered. I can't watch it. Roland shook his head slowly. There was a lesson here, he realized. Not a shining thing, but something that was old and rusty and misshapen. It was why their fathers had let them come. And with his usual stubborn and inarticulate doggedness, Roland laid mental hands on whatever it was. You can, Bert. I won't sleep tonight. Then you won't, Roland said, not seeing what that had to do with it. Cuthbert suddenly seized Roland's hand and looked at him with such mute agony that Roland's own doubt came back, and he wished sickly that they had never gone to the West Kitchen that night. His father had been right. Better every man, woman, and child in Farson than this. But whatever the lesson was, rusty, half-buried thing, he would not let it go or give up his grip on it. Let's not go up, Cuthbert said. We've seen everything. And Roland nodded reluctantly, feeling his grip on that thing, whatever it was, weaken. Court, he knew, would have knocked them both sprawling and then forced them up to the platform, step by cursing step, and sniffing fresh blood back up their noses as they went. Court would probably have looped new hemp over the yardarm itself and put the noose around each of their necks in turn, would have made them stand on the trap to feel it, and Court would have been ready to strike them again if either wept or lost control of his bladder. And Court, of course, would have been right. For the first time in his life, Roland found himself hating his own childhood. He wished for the size and calluses and sureness of age. He deliberately pried a splinter from the railing and placed it in his breast pocket before turning away. Why did you do that? Cuthbert asked. He wished to answer something swaggering. Oh, the luck of the gallows. But he only looked at Cuthbert and shook his head. Just so I'll have it, he said. Always have it. They walked away from the gallows, sat down, and waited. In an hour or so the first of them began to gather, mostly families who had come in broken-down wagons and shays, carrying their breakfasts with them, hampers of cold pancakes folded over fillings of wild strawberry jam. Roland felt his stomach growl hungrily, and wondered again, with despair, where the honor and the nobility of it was. It seemed to him that Hacks and his dirty whites, walking around and around his steaming subterranean kitchen, had had more honor than this. He fingered the splinter from the gallows tree with sick bewilderment. Cuthbert lay beside him, with his face made impassive. In the end, it was not so much, and Roland was glad. Hacks was carried in an open cart, but only his huge girth gave him away. He had been blindfolded with a wide black cloth that hung down over his face. A few threw stones, but most merely continued with their breakfasts. A gunslinger, whom the boy did not know, and he was glad his father had not drawn the lot, led the fat cook carefully up the steps. 2 guards of the watch had gone ahead and stood on either side of the trap. When Hacks and the gunslinger reached the top, the gunslinger threw the noosed rope over the cross tree and then put it over the cook's head, dropping the knot until it lay just below the left ear. The birds had all flown in, but Roland knew they were waiting. Do you wish to make confession? The gunslinger asked. I have nothing to confess, Hacks said. His words carried well, and his voice was oddly dignified, in spite of the muffle of cloth which hung over his lips. The cloth ruffled slightly in the faint, pleasant breeze that had blown up. I have not forgotten my father's face. It has been with me through all. Roland glanced sharply at the crowd and was disturbed by what he saw there. A sense of sympathy, perhaps admiration? He would ask his father. When traitors are called heroes, or heroes traitors, he supposed, in his frowning way. Dark times must have fallen. He wished he understood better. His mind flashed to Court and to the bread Court had given them. He felt contempt. The day was coming when Court would serve him. Perhaps not Cuthbert. Perhaps Cuthbert would buckle under Court's steady fire and remain a page or a horseboy, or, infinitely worse, a perfumed diplomat, dallying in receiving chambers or looking into bogus crystal balls with doddering kings and princes. But he would not. He knew it. Roland, I'm here. He took Cuthbert's hand, and their fingers locked together like iron. The trap dropped. Hacks plummeted through. And in the sudden stillness there was a sound. That sound an exploding pine knot makes on the hearth during a cold winter night. But it was not so much. The cook's legs kicked out once in a wide Y. The crowd made a satisfied whistling noise. The guards of the watch dropped their military pose and began to gather things up negligently. The gunslinger walked back down the steps slowly, mounted his horse, and rode off, cutting roughly through one gaggle of picnickers, making them scurry. The crowd dispersed rapidly after that, and in 40 minutes the two boys were left alone on the small hill they had chosen. The birds were returning to examine their new prize. One lit on Hax's shoulder and sat there chummily, darting its beak at the bright and shiny hoop Hax had always worn in his right ear. "It doesn't look like him at all," Cuthbert said. "Oh, yes, it does," Roland said confidently as they walked towards the gallows, the bread in their hands. Cuthbert looked abashed. They paused beneath the cross-tree, looking up at the dangling, twisting body. Cuthbert reached up and touched one hairy ankle defiantly. The body started on a new, twisting arc. Then, rapidly, they broke the bread and spread the crumbs beneath the dangling feet. Roland looked back just once as they rode away. Now there were thousands of birds. The bread, he grasped this only dimly, was symbolic then. "It was good," Cuthbert said suddenly. I liked it, I did." Roland was not shocked by this, although he had not particularly cared for the scene, but he thought he could perhaps understand it. "I don't know about that," he said, "but it was something. It surely was." The land did not fall to the good man for another 10 years, and by that time he was a gunslinger. His father was dead, he himself had become a matricide, and the world had moved on. 3. "Look," Jake said, pointing upward. The gunslinger looked up and felt an obscure joint in his back pop. They had been in the foothills for 2 days now, and although the water skins were almost empty again, it didn't matter now. There would soon be all the water they could drink. He followed the vector of Jake's finger upward, past the rise of the green plain to the naked and flashing cliffs and gorges above it, and on up toward the snowcap itself. Faint and far, nothing but a tiny dot. It might have been one of those motes that dance perpetually in front of the eyes, except for its constancy. The gunslinger beheld the man in black, moving up the slopes with deadly progress, a minuscule fly on a huge granite wall. "Is that him?" Jake asked. The gunslinger looked at the depersonalized mote doing its faraway acrobatics, feeling nothing but a premonition of sorrow. "That's him, Jake." "Do you think we'll catch him?" "Not on this side, on the other, and not if we stand here talking about it." "They're so high," Jake said. "What's on the other side?" "I don't know," the gunslinger said. "I don't think anybody does. Maybe they did once. Come on, boy." They began to move upward again, sending small runnels of pebbles and sand down towards the desert that washed away behind them in the flat baked sheet that seemed to never end. Above them, far above, the man in black moved up and up and up. It was impossible to see if he looked back. He seemed to leap across impossible gulfs, to scale sheer faces. Once or twice he disappeared, but always they saw him again, until the violet curtain of dusk shut him out of their view. When they made their camp for the evening, the boy spoke little, and the gunslinger wondered if the boy knew what he had already intuited. He thought of Cuthbert's face, hot, dismayed, excited. He thought of the crumbs, he thought of the birds. It ends this way, he thought. Again and again it ends this way. There are quests and roads that lead ever onward, and all of them end in the same place, upon the killing ground, except perhaps the road to the tower. The boy, the sacrifice. His face innocent and very young in the light of their tiny fire, had fallen asleep over his beans. The gunslinger covered him with the horse blanket and then curled up to sleep himself. This was the last part of Chapter 2, The Way Station. Next, we'll move on to Chapter 3, The Oracle and the Mountains.